Welcome to Paradise Valley Community College. I'm Dr. Burton, and this is the second in our public philosophy lecture series for the spring semester. So I'd like to welcome you guys out. I want to make a couple of announcements before we begin. The first announcement is that the speaker from last month, Dr. Rod Tussing, his book is now out. We talked about letting you know when it would come out. So his book was released this week. This is the title, Religion and Science, Deconstructing a Modern Paradigm. So if you want to check that book out, you can order it on Amazon. We just uploaded it. So the ebook is there. It takes a few days for them to have the print version, so be patient. But if you follow me on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever, social media, you can see when it's out. So I wanted to let you know about that. And I also want to let you know about some of our other events. So if you go to the public-philosophy.com site, we have a couple events coming up. Dr. Gingity is giving a talk on March 5th at GCU, and we have the book discussion that's ongoing at PVCC. Our next discussion is on March 8th, Chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We had a really great discussion the first time. Please read if you're going to come to that, because that was part of it. We didn't all read the text, and we need that as our common ground. So please read that. Now there's another event coming up. I'm going to just mute this. Do you need PowerPoint or anything? I'm just going to mute this. We have another event coming up. I just got the flyer today, and it's our third lecture, Dr. Owen Anderson, What Has Jerusalem to Do with Athens? And here's a little description. From the inception of the Christian tradition, thinkers have wondered about the relationship between philosophy and theology. If you have wondered about this relationship too, then come to PVCC alumnus Dr. Owen Anderson's talk, What Has Jerusalem to Do with Athens, on Tuesday, April 2nd. And it will be here in KSC 1000A at 6 o'clock p.m. I will put this on the Public Philosophy website and on social media, and I'll put it up in the classroom and on my door. So if you have any questions, just find me, and I'll let you know what's going on. Looks like we have a really good turnout tonight, so thank you all for coming. And I would like to introduce to you my very good friend, Arturo Gastelum. He is going to be talking about Socrates, the exemplary teacher. He was also a PVCC student. So part of this lecture series is we're bringing back former philosophy students to talk. So Professor Gastelum, come and...
Hello, good evening. First of all, if you are one of my students, please see me after the talk, and I will reward you. Well, thank you all for coming. I will encourage you to write down any questions you may have as we go along. I was forced to condense a lot of information into this time frame, so if you can write them down so you don't forget them, and then we can have some time to elaborate on them, that would be of much help. So here we come, Socrates, the exemplary teacher. There are a few remarks I'd like to make about Socrates. Socrates' name, of course, and fame is well known to us all. It is well known that he was a turning point in Plato's journey, that Aristotle sought to build on the contribution of the two of them, and that pretty much the entire Western tradition has been trying to work out the implications of their ideas. So his legacy is uncontested. He will be numbered as the greatest teachers in the history of mankind. And so the desire is to look into his life and approach and try to build upon what is worth preserving. So this is not going to be a lecture regarding what the true Socrates is in the Platonic dialogues or some other polemics, but what can we see into the life and work of Socrates, which can be of benefit to us as we seek to pursue wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Although Socrates has been greatly discussed in the history of philosophy, and pretty much every prominent philosopher has had to deal with this creature, this being. And for some, he has been the antithesis of of progress. When I came into Socrates, I came in through Nietzsche. So he tried to spoil him for me, but he did not. He could not. He was never quite convincing. There was some charm about Socrates which kind of transcended the offhanded comments that Nietzsche made. And I think there is a lasting legacy in Socrates. So as we come to Socrates, we have to regard him as a person and his teaching. And the question is, did Socrates teach anything? Right? That's the even the experts that go through the field, go through the entire corpus, and then in the end, and can you affirm one thing that Socrates taught? Because he is very playful. He engages in serious play. He's ironic. He's humorous. He's able to mess with the minds of those around him, but he always does it for their good. So I hope you keep that in mind as we go through the lecture. Is that Socrates' agility of mind was used for the good of his hearers, even though the hearers may not have perceived it. So, my desire is to attempt to elucidate some of the lessons that we can learn from the man and his methodology. Now, I will address his methodology down the line because you cannot just simply jump into the Socratic method, and that would be a crude injustice to what goes into thinking about Socrates and his work. There are many assumptions that have to be laid out for you to speak meaningfully of the Socratic method. And in looking at Socrates, it is conventionally thought as, we usually look as an individual, and I think we would like to kind of correct that a little bit. I'll provide some of his historical context. So as we come to Socrates, the historical context in which Socrates found himself was not much different than ours. He was pretty much at the center of civilization in his time. Okay? It was the most preeminent state, the most powerful city at its time, and he was the most admired as well. You know, the glory that was Greece. It enjoyed prosperity, cultural flourishing, and sought to lay the basis for a lasting culture. The Greeks were intently seeking to implement the wisdom that they derived from Hesiod and from Homer, as well as the pre-Socratics. And so while Socrates was growing up, he came into the picture 10 years after the apex of military prowess of the Greeks. They were able to outmaneuver and defeat the Persian Empire both in 490 and 480. He lived through the age of Pericles, of course. The dramaticians flourished at the time. The Parthenon was built. And you have theater flourishing and the comedians. And so Socrates was in the midst of all that, and what seemed like a very opulent and fruitful civilization came to a halt. And that halt, of course, is narrated to us by Thucydides through the Peloponnesian War. Now, what's ironic is what was evident to Socrates was not evident to those around him. It took until 404 BCE for the people to realize that their civilization was in shambles, that they needed to rebuild, that there was a need for another basis of education, new values to come in and reinvigorate the Greek mindset. And that is where Socrates comes in. So when you think of Socrates, you should think of him as a reaction to the excesses of polytheism, superstition, and the backdrop of both Hesiod in his Theogony as well as Homer in his Iliad and Odyssey. You also need to keep in mind the inconclusive philosophical speculations of the pre-Socratics. This is the Ionian thinkers that came to the rise to try to question and search for the arche. And the arche simply stands for a principle of an account of origin and purpose for the universe. And there are three significant proponents of that, which Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are going to have to deal with. And you have Heraclitus, which speculated that all is flux, and then at the expense of permanence. And then you have Parmenides proposing his apeiron, which is the boundless, or the the unchanging reality, which denied change. And then lastly, you have Democritus and the atomic theory. You have a materialist philosophy that sought to incorporate both change and permanence by postulating the atom as the indivisible particle. In the political and economic realms, you have Solon and Cleisthenes. So in the 5th century, if you were to think of Athens, it was pretty much an economic and political revival, the rise of democracy and so on. And that was seen as a pinnacle of its contribution. But as we come to Socrates, he was laboring in his own way to try to begin this establishment of a what's called a new paideia, trying to identify the values, cultural and educational values that can provide a firmer foundation than what was there before. Political freedom is not sufficient without some form of framework of moral order, and that entailing also some metaphysical conceptions and epistemological responsibilities. And so, as we come to Socrates, the 4th century gave rise to a deeper analysis than previously undertaken. Socrates was the pioneer of this significant project. So when you think of him as the pretty much the teacher of Hellas. He is now going to be a new hero. He is going to outperform those who came before him. If you were impressed by Achilles' agility and muscles, Socrates had him by a lot. Epistemologically, he was able to run circles around you, right? You couldn't see it coming. It was like intellectual judo. He was so much faster and more agile. And then if you think of Odysseus as a very clever man, but he usually uses cleverness for the sake of, returning to his wife and outsmart the gods and so on. Socrates is going to use this agility of mind to be able to pursue wisdom. So the contrast is so radical. It's so staggering. And then last of all, if you like Hercules and his labors, the monster that he had to slay, Socrates had to slay bigger monsters. Right? He had to deal with faulty assumptions and presuppositions. He had to fight these enemies that were there, and you can identify them. On the one hand, it was superstition, claims to belief without sufficient justification, on the one hand. On the other one, you have materialism with the pre-Socratics. And then you have, of course, the influence of the sophists in seeking to manipulate the people. And so if you put the three of them side by side, they were quite a group to contend against, but yet Socrates took upon them. Now, there is only one passage in the entire corpus of Socrates where he claims himself to be a teacher, and that was ironically against Gorgias. If you are to read the Platonic dialogues, I would suggest begin with the Apology, then move on to the Protagoras, then go to Gorgias, and then finish with the Republic. I think that will be a good segue of continual increase of complexity of thought and dealing with the ideas. But he is contending to Gorgias being the most prominent sophist of the time, and they are discussing the topic of rhetoric. And of course, Socrates begins by asking the question, one of his students asking the question to Gorgias, "Who are you?" Now, ordinarily, that would be a peculiar question to ask somebody, "Who are you?" He was not just asking, "What's your name?" He was just, "What are you? Who are you? What kind of a being? What is your function?" And Gorgias, of course, responds as, "I'm a rhetorician. I persuade people." And then Socrates comes back and says, "But persuade them of what?" Persuasion in and of itself is not something that you can speak of. And so Socrates goes on and explains how he is the only educator. He is the only statesman. So now what's going to be interesting is that he makes that statement, but then later on, if you're familiar with Socrates' writings, he is going to tell you that he doesn't teach anything to anyone. So as you read the dialogues, please be aware of the complexities that he is going to go into, and the kind of mental strain that he puts on you to be able to see the irony in what he is saying. So he was correct. He was the one that was searching after the truth, and he is having to engage with these faulty assumptions. And as you well know, Socrates did not write anything of his own, but thankfully, we have the genius of Plato to be able to bring this into a reality for us. It is known by tradition that Plato supposedly had other writings, and the moment he encountered Socrates' philosophy, he went and burned them. And then he went and employed poetry in the service of philosophy and combined them into, what still remains a philosophical corpus that is read time and time and time again. So there you have Socrates as we know him through Plato. I will not address the Xenophon Plato that we have, because that's a very, it's like a plebeian notion of Socrates. It's just a wise man. He lacks the polished mind, the ability to follow rigorous arguments, and to be able to do all that other work that Plato does. So I'm primarily working from the Platonic dialogues as we have them. And like I said, I'm not going to go much into which ones are the true Socrates or not. I think there are certain qualities about Socrates that are pervasive throughout the dialogues. I think those are the things that I like to emphasize, the things that are proper to philosophy itself and the attitude that goes into doing philosophy. I think those are clearly there. So as we go into Socrates, I mentioned that there are assumptions regarding epistemology on the nature of knowledge, which Plato is going to Socrates is going to operate under. There are understandings about human nature that are going to be all throughout the Platonic dialogues. Right? There are things that you have to know that Socrates has in mind as he engages. And then, of course, there are what's called ethics of belief, the responsibilities that we bear for the beliefs that we hold. And Socrates is going to be one of those people that he's going to hold you responsible for things that you should have known. And if you did not, then it is on you. Because he understood that all that is needed for you to know was to engage your mind. You don't need a political permission to think about the nature of reality. Right? You don't need to check or clock in or get paid for. It's something that you can engage anywhere at all times. Even if you're doing one of those mind-numbing works that Karl Marx so much dreaded, even when you're just doing one repetitive motion, you can still think about basic things. So, right, there's ample room for reflection and meditation in that case. So, let us go ahead and begin by first analyzing the word education. And I like to bring up its classical sense in which we speak about education. That would be the Latin root of educare. And by that I mean education means to bring forth what is latent in the human person. It is really to bring what is best in you. It's being able to develop, to harness your talents, your abilities. Aristotle will speak of it on human flourishing. Right? It's be all you can be kind of army. Is that army or? Yeah. Got it. Be all you can be. It's mastering yourself. So it is mastery over the self primarily, and over one's own passions and beliefs and actions. So we're going to have a dynamic here where the student, as the recipient of knowledge, is going to have to be an actively engaged in that pursuit. And the teacher has a responsibility to the students. The way Plato describes it in the Symposium is going up the ladder of love. Now, by that it means it's just simply ascending in growth in understanding every step of the way. And the mentor, the teacher, is the one that is able to challenge and encourage the student in that direction. So what you have there is a gradual ascension in the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. This is a gradual process. There is no shortcut. Sorry. Extra credit point is not going to do it. This is a day-to-day, lifelong discipline and habit that will have to be undergone there. So, as we explore concepts embedded in Plato and in Socrates, it's one thing that's going to be important is that the words that we're accustomed to hear have a much deeper meaning. So when we speak about love in a Socratic sense, he is really speaking about the improvement of the human being. It's not just physical affection, right? It's not getting somebody to like you. It's not just simply encouragement. It is actually growth and development. It is seeking after the improvement of the soul or the intellectual growth of the person. And that is going to be very multifaceted. So Socrates spends quite some time on the Symposium in the Phaedrus dealing with that, because it is such an important component of human life. And it is going to come down to love being the pursuit of the good life. If you love someone, you will encourage them into doing that, pursuing that which is best for them and for yourself, a mutual reciprocal engagement. So as the lecture proceeds, I like to continue to bring these concepts that are going to be brought up that we are quite acquainted with. We hear them, but I'm not sure to what extent we stop and reflect about their meaning. Okay? So when you say, I am an educated person, are you really cognizant of what that entails? Are you really saying, I am someone who has sharpened their minds and abilities to harness them in pursuit of that which is good and lasting? Or are you simply saying, I have a degree? Right? I went through the undergraduate classes, I made it. Or do I have inculcated and developed in me habits of learning and meditation that will help me in my growth? So the key in unlocking the potential attainable in a human being is going to be done through education, particularly through knowledge. That is going to be a theme throughout the dialogues, and that is the only way to motivate and to get to a person and to teach virtue or arete, it's going to be through knowledge. It's by teaching a person the nature of reality and the truth. It is evident in the Socratic dialogues that knowledge is a precondition for right behavior. It is the belief that knowledge of the truth will set a person free from the limitations of falsehood, errors, misconceptions, the limited historical background to which they are surrounded, and the worldview that may be permeated in the culture. So the Socratic person will have some of this cosmopolitan Aristotelian sense. You're like a citizen of the world. You're a person that is able to critically examine what you're being presented with. And be able to reflect and analyze that, and not be subject to what Francis Bacon will later speak about, the idols of the cave, right? The 4 idols that will influence us without us being much cognizant of it. So knowing what is good enables and propels a person towards carrying out actions consistent with the good. So that is consistent with the telos, or goal of human nature. That's going to be another word to keep in mind, is Plato, Socrates, Aristotle are all going to be teleological, goal-oriented. That's one of those key concepts that has to be kept in mind. There is always a purpose for, either in human natures and in nature as a whole. The sophists claim too much about education. And if you've been an educator for a while, you can sympathize with this abuse. So Socrates is not just coming into the scene with a clean slate. You're having now to contend with the sophists. And the sophists are making a profession that goes far beyond what education can do. Right? And that is going to be, the sophists claim that they will make you into a virtuous person. If you just pay enough money, you will be transformed into a better human being. And Socrates is going to be mindful of a limitation, and he is going to make the claim that he never taught anyone anything. So at this point, I'll ask you to think about, how can we say that Socrates is the greatest teacher of his time, and yet he claims himself that he never taught anything to anyone? I mean, how about if I gave you that as my credentials? If you hire me, I guarantee you, I will never teach anything. You will never learn a thing from me. So this is part of those ironic statements that you have from Socrates. So as you see, the use of irony is going to be pervasive. The reason why Socrates claimed to never have taught anything is that he understood that understanding is imminently an activity of one's mind. It requires a deliberate effort on the part of the student to grasp the meaning of what is being said. Okay? It doesn't matter what I do, what format, how many PowerPoint presentations and voices I can impersonate and accents and whatever else you may be inclined to like, unless the person has a care and concern for what is being taught, unless they apply themselves, you cannot force anyone to believe anything. I think that is the power of the apprehension of the mind. And that is where Socrates so wisely said, I never taught anyone anything. I could not help you grasp, I cannot force you to grasp a concept. That's something that you're going to have to reach out and do it. So that's why he can so clearly say, I never taught anyone, but yet I'm the greatest teacher. Right? At the same time, both are true in different perspectives. Okay. So keep that in mind. That's kind of ambiguities that are going to be there in place with words that Socrates is so masterful able to do. In fact, at the beginning of the Republic, as Socrates is descending into the city, and you're going to have the imagery, Zarathustra did the same thing, and just coming down with the many. And Polemarchus, who is the son of Cephalus, is going to send his servant, and the servant is going to reach out to Socrates and very undignifiedly grab him by the toga. And then Socrates turns around and says, how can I help you? And the guy said, we need you to come to Cephalus' house. And Socrates says, can we discuss this? And can I persuade you otherwise? And he said, can you persuade me if I don't listen to you? Ha ha ha. And then he laughs and says, do you see how many we are? And so he's compelling Socrates, and Socrates is forced to condescend and have to engage with them. And of course, then that gives rise to the greatest book that Plato had. And so this idea of the disposition of the student and the responsibility to learning is going to be there as we engage with Socrates. So as I was reading the literature on Socrates, it is a very contentious point. What is there to be learned about this man, Socrates? And that's what I like to elucidate at the end of the talk. I like to develop 10 points by which I will kind of summarize the things that at least I'm able to perceive that are there in Socrates, that are distinctively from Socrates that we can build upon. So not only did Socrates have to contend with the just hubris of the sophists, thinking that they can teach virtue, he then had to deal with those who reduce education to merely to a techne, to something that is a know-how knowledge, practical, technical knowledge of reality. And I think both miss the mark there. Both don't hold the learner responsible for the epistemic responsibility they have as human beings. And that is something that Socrates will be very, very, very plain, is that all can be taught. He spoke to anyone that desired to talk to him. Old or young, slave or free, did not matter. He would engage with that. So as Socrates engages in education, he is also going to engage in trying to attain true knowledge. And by that he means a justified through belief, having a belief which has a logos or an account for it. And there's got to be proper justification for us to claim to have knowledge. So it is not enough to profess the right thing, and it is not enough to do the right thing, right? Because that's where the sophists would have come in, trying to justitiate you or give the appearance of knowledge, or the pious. But it is essential that the person understands what they believe and be able to withstand challenges to it. And that's where the process of education begins and continues as a lifelong endeavor. There is not an end to the growth that we can undergo in understanding our beliefs and being able to engage with them, understanding the meaning of it. So, before the Socratic method as such, before we engage with that, I like to understand a few things that Socrates believed about the human person, which I think are going to be important, and we cannot bypass it. In my development as an educator, a succinct statement regarding pedagogy, which, by the way, was a word invented by Plato, which was to rear and bring forth through proper learning, has remained with me in its most applicable to Socrates. It is this short statement: a faithful teacher is one who loves the subject and one who loves the student. That's what a good teacher is going to do. If you love the subject and the student, you can't have one or the other, right? If you've been in a classroom, you know what a painstaking, laborious activity that is. Okay? It requires quite a bit of endurance. But if you love the students, then you will do what is needed to awaken them from that intellectual slumber. Okay? So it is going to be essential. And when I mean love of the subject, I don't mean simply isolated expertise, like I really like quantum mechanics and I'll tell you everything about. No. By this I mean knowledge in the sense of the university in its etymological meaning, a universe, an integrated understanding of the fields of science and both natural and social sciences. So it is not just simply one aspect of knowledge, but it is the interconnectedness of how disciplines relate in the pursuit of a holistic understanding. So one thing that I like to emphasize about Socrates before we go into his methodology is his conception of the human person. It is, according to Werner Jaeger, who wrote the book Paideia, The Ideals of Greek Culture, which is a foundational work in understanding Socrates' role as a teacher, he says it was Socrates summoning men to care for their souls that really turned the mind of Greece towards a new way of life. I like to bring that up about Socrates. He is going to develop a conception of the human person and the human soul in a way that is much more intimate, much more valuable, much more dignified, and much more lasting than what was there before. So what you're going to have is Socrates is going to see his pursuit of education as an exercise of piety. And he says that explicitly in the Apology. It was a service to the God. I'm doing this for my own good and the good of others. This is a calling. It is something that he is fulfilling. So it is something that he could not renounce without renouncing himself. To not engage in this quest will be to stop seeking the good for himself and for those closest to him, which means not to love them, not to love yourself, and not to love those who are with you. It tantamounts to forfeiting a life worthwhile living, or life deserving of our own humanity. So there is a dignity to the human person which is endowed with rationality that is to be called forth by this process of education and question and answering. So as an educator, he had a high estimation of human nature. Socrates was the first Greek to place exceptional emphasis, and I make that emphatic, exceptional, with passionate and beseeching urgency about caring for one's soul, caring for one's own intellectual growth and development. No Greek before him had put that emphasis to the human person. It echoes sayings like, what profits a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own mind or soul? Socrates professed a belief in the immortality of the soul. So that's one of those beliefs that are going to be there. It's tangible, palpable throughout all the Socratic dialogues, be it his theory of reincarnation, or the Phaedo, or the Crito, or the Apology. He's going to be leaning back on that, and the importance of that is that he is going to see a continuity on the human person, which means what he is teaching to this person is going to have a lasting effect in their lives now and in the life to come. So it was not a materialistic conception: when you're dead, you're dead. Hope you don't mess things too badly. I hope you only have like 25 years. No, this is, he conceived of the human person as something that was lasting, and therefore ignorance multiplied times infinity, it's bad. Bad. It grows exponentially as time goes on. But so is the other flip side of it. Proper knowledge of life can be multiplied and increased for the perpetuity. The love of Socrates it was very typical in ancient Athens to emphasize the physical, the sensual. You have Bacchus and the pretty much the desire for the sensual. And Alcibiades, who was one of the best-looking men of Greece, how many of you have statues made of you when you were a child? It's not going to happen, huh? Alcibiades was so beautiful. The statues we made of him. And Alcibiades made a statement at the end of the symposium, and he says, no one loved like Socrates. And by that he meant, no one has the degree of concern for the welfare of your intellectual and spiritual life the way Socrates has sought it after. And he was emphatic about that. So if you were to think of Socrates, you should think of him as a doctor of the soul, right? A physician will usually try to get you back to health, strength, and beauty. Right? That will be the capabilities of your body. And if they can do that, they'll make money. Socrates had a different conception of that. If he can get you to recognizing your actual state of affairs, the truthfulness or falsehood of your beliefs, to reevaluate your belief system, to rechannel your thinking, that's what he will see as a purposeful, intentional pursuit of knowledge. He sought to diagnose a sickness, and he had a name for it. It's called apaudesia, which means ignorance of the greatest things. Imagine if somebody walked around and said, you don't know the basic things. You don't understand the nature of the world. Do you have proof for the existence of the soul? Is there a highest good? He said, no. Okay, then apaudesia. You fail. You don't know the things that you should. That's an epistemic weight that there is there. He's expecting human beings to engage in this, to know the things that are of greatest importance. So his calling was to cure those around him from their lack of understanding. And this is what he calls his teaching. He summarizes as Plato does that for us. And I'll read this because you can't improve upon Plato's rhetoric. At least not me. That's for sure. He says, Socrates identifies what his teaching is, and he says, if the person with whom I am arguing says, I do care, if they are professing to actually want to know, right, that just lights Socrates in the inside. Now he's like, he can go for it. Then I do not leave him or let him go out at once. But I proceed to interrogate and examine and cross-examine him. And if I think that he has no virtue in him, he's an imposter, he claimed to know, but he didn't. He doesn't just simply walk away and say, you're a fool. But only says that he has it, he professes to have knowledge or interest, but he actually doesn't have knowledge. I reproach him for undervaluing the greater and overvaluing the less. So that's what he identifies as his primary concern. You don't have your priorities straight. You're not keeping the most important things in mind, and you are putting secondary things in the place of the primary things. And that is something that you ought to change your mind about and begin to get your thinking straight. And I shall repeat the same words to everyone whom I meet, young and old, citizen and alien, for I believe that no greater good has ever happened to the state than my service to the God. So this function that he was performing in awakening people from their intellectual slumber and not letting them be comfortable with their claims to knowledge, but probing them and cross-examining them. For I do nothing but to go about persuading you all and young alike, not to take thought of your persons or your properties, but first and chiefly to take care about the greatest improvement of your soul. He says, this is my teaching. And then if you get to the end of the book, this is what he charges the Athenian people with. You are cutting me off, and I have 3 children. And I hope you do to them as I did to you. So this is the project in which Socrates is engaging. And the other aspect about Socrates' concern for the soul is also the fact that he is concerned for the individual right in front of him. Many of the dialogues may turn out to be disappointing. And the reason is because the interlocutor is just a poor interlocutor. Some of them are just lazy. Some of them are in a hurry. Some of them have a temperament. And so some of them lose it before Socrates even gets going. Some of them begin to blame him for their own ignorance. Socrates, I knew what virtue was. I could have told you everything about it. Meno would have told you. But now you're asking me questions, and you have like one of those poisons that immobilizes you. And now I feel like I forgot everything I knew, and it's you. I said, well, why don't you realize, Meno, that maybe you did not know, and Gorgias just took your money and did not really help you. And I'm helping you realize that. So he is going to find people in specific contexts. Of course, the Euthyphro is one stands out, one of the most. Socrates is going to be prosecuted in court. And there's this other man sitting there, Euthyphro, and says, hey, Euthyphro, how are you doing? Hey, Socrates, what's going on? And they say, well, I'm here. Well, what are you here for? Well, I bring in charges of murder to someone. He said, wow, what happened? It's my dad. Did he kill your mom? Who did he kill? Your brother? What did he do? He said, no, he actually, a servant of ours got drunk, killed somebody else. My dad tied him down and went to the police. When he came back, the guy died. So now I have to turn my dad in. And said, whoa, you must be very certain that that's deserving of death. He said, yes, that's the pious thing to do. That's the pious thing. He said, whoa, really? That's great. I'm being accused of impiety. Why don't you come and teach me about piety? And unfortunately, by the time before Socrates gets going on it, the guy just said, I don't have time for this, Socrates. I'm sorry, I have to put my dad to death. I can't slow down in life. So that's just one example of many interlocutors. There are 34 interlocutors in Socrates' dialogues. Only 7 of them recognize their ignorance and are willing to change. The rest of them respond in diverse ways, avoiding to engage with that. So he lived the quest that he was pursuing. And that's something that you cannot blame Socrates for. He really engaged, lived with these human beings, and he tried to put the principles that he articulated into practice. That's why it kind of stands out among the rest of mankind, the fact that he was so faithful to his commitment in his convictions. Now, I'm not saying that his convictions were all correct, but to the degree that he held them, he applied them. And that's something that you can keep in mind. Now, that's very different from what we know of the history of ideas. Right? I was reading on the French Revolution the other day, and this statement came across. It says, Maximilien Robespierre loved mankind in the abstract, but he hated his neighbor. Right? So you have an intellectual writing about the goodness and the improvement and liberty, equality, and fraternity, and so on, but I'm not going to go and help you. You got to be kidding me. The British historian Paul Johnson, now this is like gossip behind the scenes. So I don't know if you want to go and pierce into it, but he wrote a book called The Intellectuals, where he goes and looks into some of the most prominent thinkers in the last 200 years, and then gives you a glimpse into their private lives. And he's like, ooh, man, publicly you were such an inspiring, encouraging human being. Privately, I wouldn't want to be close to you at all. But that's the nature of things. You don't have that with Socrates. That is something that distinguishes him. So what we see in Socrates is a man seeking to have logical and existential unity and consistency. I mean, that's really what he's trying to do. And he's going to be tested time and time again to be able to abandon his principles. And he is going to stand steady with them. For example, there is the dialogue called the Crito. And Crito comes to Socrates the day before he's actually going to be killed. And Crito is just sitting there, and then Socrates wakes up, and Socrates says, well, hey, Crito, what are you doing here? He said, well, I've been here for a while. Well, how long have you been here for? You should have woken me up. He says, no, I feel bad for you, Socrates. You must be in such a bad state of mind with all these bad things that are happening to you. I thought, sleeping will do you well. Again, Crito is well-intended. He's a nice guy. That's the other thing about these interlocutors. You can imagine them as real people. I see him somewhere in his 60s, very concerned, upright, and so on. And he comes to Socrates and says, Socrates, I have really good reasons to help you out. First of all, I have a lot of money, and you are my friend, and I don't want people to say of me that I didn't use my resources to help you out. I mean, that would be awful. How would I live with myself? The many will judge me. And of course, Socrates is going to say, who cares about the many? And you're going to have Crito and saying, Socrates, you're in jail because of the many. So they can do bad things. They can put you in jail and put you to death. And then Socrates is going to have to go on and explain how that's not something to be feared. Right? What is to be feared is to do something that you knowingly know, that you know in fact is wrong. And that's what he persuades Crito of. And Crito in the end ends up agreeing with Socrates that dying is the right thing to do at the time, even though he will leave his children behind and he is, dying a very ignominious death, very undignified. He's being put to death as a corrupter of the youth. So what you see in Socrates is what in I believe it is Roman Catholic tradition, what they call the exemplary cause. It's a way in which you teach others by your own actions. It's a way in which you can see what proper behavior looks like and good thinking looks like by the example that you provide. So as an educator, that is going to be an essential component of teaching. If you don't live out the principles that you postulate in the classroom, then the charge of hypocrisy is what's going to come to mind, and that usually leads to contempt. Right? You're claiming the examined life, and yet you live the unexamined life. So throughout his life, he claimed that the daemon, this conscience, was guiding him and was usually speaking to him as a negative guide. When he was doing something wrong, it would show up and then tell him that he was misplacing his concern. So he remained faithful to his convictions to the point of shedding blood, and he became the first martyr of philosophy at the feet of conventional wisdom. The complacency of the many and the pride of the few led to his destruction. So, as we approach now, we have a sense of Socrates' conception of the human person, the immortality of the soul, the love for other human beings, the concreteness of their existence, and so on. I like to go ahead and begin to enumerate some of the values and ideas that I see in Socrates that are worth emulating and examining further. Now, I won't exposit them for long, so I will number them for ease, and we can proceed with this. First, a disclaimer. Anytime you hear the Socratic Method, you should just cringe. Right? I've been in those 2-3 day seminars. It's like, we're going to teach you how to employ the Socratic Method. And then they strip it down to just this stale, worthless questions. What do you mean? Can you explain yourself? You just said the opposite before. And they miss the entire point. I mean, you cannot be a Socratic teacher and then leave the life of the thoughtless outside of the class. This is a way of life, right? You cannot just put the hat on of now I'm thinking Socratically and then I'm not thinking Socratically. This is great. You can't do that. This is a way of life. So, as an educator, that's just one of those things. It's like, the only thing Socratic about that is just the name, right? So, I will number a few things that you should keep in mind as you address Socrates. One is the fact that he believed in the possibility of knowledge. That doesn't mean that he attained it, but he did emphasize that, and so the inescapable reality of denying knowledge, which of course is going to lead to nihilism, denial of all meaning. So he strived for it. He believed that it can be attained, and it can be attained by reasoning, that ideas can be tested. He believed that they can be examined. He summarizes it in this way. He says, when he's talking to Crito, he says, not now for the first time, but always. I am the sort of man who is persuaded by nothing except the argument, or reason, that seems best to me when I reason about the matter. So, Crito, I would escape if you could give me if you could persuade me that is the good thing to do. But since you can't do that, I'm still going to have to die. So there is a commitment to the necessity of the possibility of knowledge in Socrates that that is there. And that is something, of course, the subsequent philosophy will abandon. People like Nietzsche and Sartre and others will take a different approach. The next one is going to be rationality in itself and the uses of rationality. So Socrates is not going to name reason as the laws of thought, but they are going to be throughout the entire corpus of Socratic discourse. He's usually asking if something is the same thing with itself and with another, whether something contradicts itself or it can be itself and something else at the same time. And if he can find that you contradict those laws of thought, then you have now engaged in the cardinal sin of philosophy, unintelligibility. Right? You're speaking meaningless terms. So what you see is a commitment to reason. So that is number 2. Reason provides the grounds for intelligibility. It is by reason that we grasp the ideas employed. And he says in a very playful manner, you can use, I was reading the Charmides, and he says, you can use whatever words you want as long as you define them and stick with them. I said, okay, Socrates. In the end, you always get your way. Essential definitions. That's what Wittgenstein's going to say. No! That's too high of a standard, Socrates. Be nice. It is by reason that we grasp the meaning of the ideas employed. Through reason, we form concepts. And then we employ those concepts to form judgments. And then those judgments are going to be used as premises in our arguments. It is by reason that we test the ideas and analyze them and see if they are coherent and if they contain meaning, understanding what they entail. If an idea is shown to violate either the law of identity, non-contradiction, or excluded middle, then it is incoherent and cannot be true and therefore ought to be discarded. It must be abandoned as a faulty assumption. But the quest in pursuit of certainty must be relentlessly pursued. So one thing is to engage in the quest for knowledge and fail in the process. The other one is to throw the entire process and the means out. So you may have misused reason. You may have reasoned wrongly about it. You may have to start over again. Now you say, well, that's like taking the same class 10 times. I'm just going to lose courage or something. I say, no, at least you know that these 10 definitions don't work. So you now have what's called negative progress. It's like, whoa, that's a fast one. I like that one. You at least know what does not work. But so on the contrary, we should recognize that it is the process of undoing faulty beliefs. And it should be a source of rejoicing. It's like, hey, I got rid of this bad idea. I never thought. I had it hanging around for so long. Finally, you free me from it. So don't misplace your pessimism. Right? It should be a source of hope, not discouragement. So you test the ideas for meaning. I will hurry up on patience. Some beliefs are more foundational than others, and that's something that you're going to see throughout the entire corpus of the Socratic discussion, is that these dialogues begin with the most incidental of things. Right? It doesn't have to be something very profound that you met at Starbucks at 5 p.m. and now you're going to discuss, the ontology of whatever, modern physics or something. No, it just starts with the most mundane things. Hey, I'm thinking about finding a teacher for my son. Oh, really? What kind of things do you want your son to be taught? Or you see a guy, a young man or woman walking by, and you say, hey, where do you go when you want to buy fish? Well, of course, Trader Joe's over there. Where do you go where you want to buy shoes? Well, Nike store. Where do you go where you want to find wisdom? And the kid's just like, I don't know. Well, come. Like, okay, I like this. It's just the most incidental things that you would ordinarily not think that will lead to a lesson. Now, I will stop short of examining reason here, but you can always have an expanded exposition of it if you take Philosophy 101 or Philosophy 103, Introduction to Philosophy or Introduction to Logic. You will not be disappointed. And Dr. Burton is here. You can sign up with her. She'll hook you up. Humans are fundamentally rational. That's the other component. Assumption number 3. Rationality is universal to all humans, regardless of gender, whether they are barbarians or Greeks, whether they are males or females, whether they're young or old. They all have the capability of reason and the responsibility for understanding. So even if a person doesn't know the answer, Socrates is expecting that they should have the concern to work for the answer. And that's what the process of education is going to entail. And think about what the consequence of engaging in proper reasoning is. I mean, the consequence of that is that you're going to be able to find meaning. You ought to understand the meaningfulness of your own existence in the world around you, right? And that is unlimited. All the combinations and relations of all things, life is too vast to be encompassed. So it's not that you realize that you don't know. I think that saying goes the more you know, the more you don't know. It should be different. It should be the more you know, the more there is to know. You increase in it. What you learn does not diminish what you had before, but it comes together and it adds. So if you do engage in this, then you can have a meaningful existence. And if you take it further, you may be able to undo some disputes with those around you. Imagine what a life it would be if you could agree with others as to what to do. Have you checked out politics lately? Have you seen the international affair and what's going on? Wouldn't it be great if there was agreement? How about if you could find both a meaningful existence and a peaceful existence? And reason be able to open the door and the way for such an engagement. Wouldn't that be a relief? On the contrary, you have the other side of it, which is if you do not engage in it, then you will have if by using reason you grasp meaning, if you fail to use reason, then you begin to lose meaning. And that is a condition of the mind. And that is a condition which leads to meaninglessness. And then out of that comes boredom. And then out of that comes this restlessness. Nobody wants to stay in a state of boredom. And then you go into excess. And then comes the guilt. And then you go back and back. So it is an existential condition that is self-destructive and anti-logos. It is anti-reason, anti-analysis. Number 4 is going to be the Socratic dictum. How many of you know what the Socratic dictum is? How many of you have it tattooed in your body? None of you? If you were to tattoo anything, that should have been it. The unexamined life is not worth living. The quest for knowledge implies this desire for intellectual and existential integrity. The application of reason comes to us for the sake of self-examination. You cannot go on and question others without first questioning yourself. Okay, physician, heal thyself, right? But that is the most amusing part. Every time I have students in my class, you know what they like? Other people being shown wrong. Oh man, is that fun, right? When they just boldly say something and then they end up just kind of coming into themselves and it's like, where did he go? He shrank into his own chair, he's so embarrassed. So no, we love that. And Socrates got in trouble because that's what the youth was doing. They love to do that. You know what, Dad? I learned this from Socrates. How do you know that Zeus exists, Dad? Really? And then the dad stumbles upon himself and he says, you see that? You don't know anything. This is so powerful. I can use it against my own dad. There are only a few people like the Theaetetus that has the capability and the willingness and longing and discipline to engage in an extensive dialogue with Socrates. So you can look at a formidable interlocutor there. So he engages in the process of examination, alenkos, and that is you cross-examine the person to see what they know, if what they know is actually true. Assumption number 5 is going to be, and this is a difficult one to swallow, and you have to discuss it more, is no one knowingly does evil. That is there throughout the entire Socratic corpus. And he uses that to defend himself against the charge of corrupting the youth. And he does it pretty fast. You know, Miletus comes and says, Socrates, yes, you are a corrupter of the youth, and And then Socrates, of course, says, well, who will teach bad things to their neighbors so that they can get harm later? Well, no one, Socrates, of course. Then why would I corrupt the youth? It doesn't make any sense. If I'm doing it and I don't know, in which you should have told me, and you should have just corrected me privately. That would have been something that you can do privately, not in a court of law at my age of 70 years. It's embarrassing, never been here before. And he uses that to be able to show this, and it is a constant assumption throughout the Platonic dialogues. The source of evil is rooted in misunderstanding or badly informed minds. If a person, he actually says that in another dialogue, where he says, if Miletus knew what I was up to, he would be my friend. He would have been my friend if he knew what I was doing. But he doesn't understand, and therefore he hates me. So that is there throughout. And Aristotle is going to come back and question that with the problem of acrasia later on. And that has been an ongoing debate in the history of philosophy, whether or not we knowingly do evil or not. The next one is going to be one of the most annoying ones, but it is very pervasive, and that is the quest for essential definitions. Socrates doesn't want examples. Okay, that's what you call an ostensive definition, kind of examples of things. He wants to know what the thing in itself is, and the entire dialogues are going to center around that. The Laches is going to be about courage, the Euthyphro is about piety, the Carmenides is about temperance, the Meno is about virtue, the Protagoras is about a sophist, the Republic is about justice. So he holds on to one concept, and he wants to know and labors at it faithfully to be able to see and pierce through it and see if he can grasp that which makes a thing what it is. Because what's going to happen is you say, Meno, can you tell me what virtue is? He's like, yeah, it's like, being a good cook and being a good warrior. I said, no, Meno, those are examples. Come on, tell me what makes all of those things virtue and so on. And that's going to be one of the dialogues that is very ironic, because in the end they conclude that virtue cannot be taught, which is not a Socratic assumption. It's just Meno is lazy to engage in it. And Socrates ironically says, sarcastically perhaps, you know what, maybe virtue is a blessing from the gods, and you, Meno, are greatly blessed. This is awesome. And Meno's like, yeah, you're right, maybe the gods just endow me with it. Awesome, let's part ways. And that's how it ends, but that's not something that is a Socratic distinctive. It's rooted in knowledge. Okay, he approaches things presuppositionally, putting what is most important first and what is less important later, and that's why he's going to move from an example of virtue to virtue itself, right? From you charging your father with murder to understanding piety itself, from discussing rhetoric to discussing truth. And that's what he's going to do time and time again, from him having to defend himself in the apology to pretty much bringing the Athenian people under judgment. He's putting it back on them. You guys are persecuting me, not because of anything that I done per se, but because by my question, I expose that you don't know when you claim to know. And you have built this resentment against me over the years. So Socrates is a tragic hero but it's a new kind of hero. It's usually Aristotle describes tragedy as atheist, some type of moral blindness. The person did something that they didn't know was wrong, but it's a moral character failure in them. Socrates knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that he was irritating people. And that is what caused his death, and not the corruption of the youth, not being an atheist, not introducing new divinities, and all this pseudo charges, which he says, no, I'm boxing with shadows. What's really happening is your pretense of knowledge has been shown, and you despise me for it. Rather than recognizing that I am doing a good for you, you turn it on me, and now you want to silence me. Well, guess what? Thank goodness we have Plato, right? Now we have the vengeance of the gods have fallen upon you. And now we have this, we don't even remember the people in the trial, but you do remember Socrates. It's a judgment and indictment. Next one, point 8, is virtue. Virtues needed to undergo a Herculean labor. And this is something that you become more and more mindful as you mature in your life, is there are certain virtues that are going to be needed for you to be able to engage in meaningful discussion. Okay? Your interlocutors are going to respond very differently. Like I said, Euthyphro comes up with a definition, and then he has to come up with another definition on the spot because he hasn't thought much about it. It's not like he says, well, give me some time. No, he just comes up with another one right on the spot. He comes through 5 definitions, just all in one shot, and then at the end it's like, nah, I'm done. Then you have you come up with a new definition. That's another, coming back with another response. Then you may say, you know what, I'm kind of tongue-tied. I'm not sure. If you ask me if you ask me what time is, time in general, not what time it is. If you ask me what time is, I kind of know, but if you ask me to explain what it is, I can't articulate it in words. Socrates, this is just difficult. I just know what virtue is and happiness, but I can't tell you in words what it is. I just feel it intuitively. So some admit that they can't put it into words, and some profess ignorance. Socrates, I'm not that good. I really don't know. Help me out. And then some, of course, just go running off. And some of them kind of bring their heavy weight. Or usually what happens is the heavyweight is there like Gorgias, and then the disciple comes in and he wants to take Socrates on. Now he just beat up your master, right? Here is the most eminent, learned sophist in the entire Mediterranean, and then you are going to come now and take upon Socrates. Come on. And they do that time and time again. It's like, so in engaging, there are certain virtues that we can keep in mind. Patience being one of them. Oh, patience. Having to deal with all the intricacies of human interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, mood, time of day. Like you guys right now, it's like diminishing returns. It's like every minute that goes by, it's just heavier and heavier. Humility, to recognize that you're wrong and save face. Imagine that one. You know what? Socrates, I never thought about the improvement of the youth. And that'd be just a miracle if Melita said that. You're right. I have never thought about it. I was just angry at you, and I wanted to get back at you, and I didn't care what it was. How about gentleness? That's what you see in Socrates. Now, he is very funny, and he does make a lot of fun about people. He only laughs once, though. In the entire corpus, he only laughs once. But he makes you laugh a lot if you're paying close attention, and he is just running circles around people, and they don't even know it. But he doesn't do it in ill. Like there are 2 brothers that just learn a new art. They call it heuristic, and that is they just simply know how to confuse people, and they play with the ambiguities of language. Things like, are you a father? Yes. And if you are a father, then you cannot not be a father. Therefore, you must be a father of everything. Ha ha ha! Look at that. I just made an argument that you have always been a father, because you cannot be a father and not a father at the same time. If you're a father, you have to remain a father, and so on. And then they just start playing games back and forth, and Socrates comes and just pats him in the back and says, you know what, this art that you have is so great, you should keep it to yourself. Just go home and talk among you and your brother, and stay there. Don't harm people. That's the Euthydemus. It's a funny dialogue. It's just hilarious. And then the last point is, everything that I've been saying is just hunky-dory, and you're all happy about it, and you think, Socrates is the greatest guy. There are consequences of employing the Socratic dialogue. So beware of that. Just because you have good intentions and you're seeking to help people growing in their understanding doesn't mean that they will reciprocate your feelings and understand what you're doing. Okay? That's what caused the demise of Socrates. He was too much of a nuance. He identified himself as a godfly. He was there probing at them and causing them to mobilize themselves and stirring up their conscience and calling them to greater consistency, and that was just too much to bear. So when you begin to question the assumptions of the current status quo, whatever that may be, just expect that there will be backlash. And Socrates paid for it. So I hope I hope you know when to stop. No, just kidding. No, keep doing it. Keep doing it. Don't give up on it. So I will stop here for the sake of opening up for questions. There are many other areas that I could have gone into, but we can do that at this time.
Professor